In our panel session on this Thursday afternoon, we delve into prospects of an extra budget bill, that is, by the incoming administration to ease the financial burden of small merchants in the wake of prolonged pandemic-related restrictions. For more, I have Professor Song Soo-young from Chung-Ang University. Professor Song, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me.
I also have Professor Oh Joon-seok from Sookmyung Women's University. Professor Oh, it's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Song, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol earlier pledged some 50 trillion won to support small merchants who have borne the brunt of pandemic-related restrictions. First, let's begin with your thoughts on the size of this particular support plan.
Yeah. In the last of February, the National Assembly has passed the small relief fund for the small merchants who have suffered from the coronavirus restriction. And that amounts to the 3 million Korean won for person per capita of the small merchants. The number has been 3.32 million people. So per capita is 3 million Korean won, and then when the 50 trillion won has been implemented for the support of the small merchants, as long as the pool of the beneficiaries of the fund remain the same, which will have 15 million Korean won per capita, unless the pool of beneficiaries has not expanded. So that means that this is may put the pressure on the President-elect Yoon to eat his own words during the campaign, because his rival candidate for the contender, Jae-myung Lee, has promised to offer 30 trillion Korean won. Then actually, President-elect Yoon offered more than that. So this is kind of the situation now. Seems to me a winner's curse, because he has promised too much for the merchants. That might put the pressure on the small merchants, even though they have suffered so much from the restriction on the business in the wake of the coronavirus.
Right. And Professor Oh, the concern actually is that the creation of yet another budget bill will aggravate the country's inflation. What are your thoughts?
Yes, coupled with the excess money supply, as Professor Song commented about the relief fund, and it is inevitable amid the pandemic. But there is another external factor in Ukraine. So as a result, consumer price index has soared up to 4%, the highest in 10 years. A red light has been blinking already in Korean economy, and the Bank of Korea said consumer price could hit the 4% rate for the time being, and due to the price increase of dining out, 6.6% up, and the processed food 6.4% up. So as a result, there is no other choice for the government to quell down this kind of inflationary pressure. But recently, Mr. CHOO KYUNG-HO, nominee of finance minister, said he will put top priority on stabilizing the prices. But he has a seemingly contradictory plan for the spending, as you mentioned, that additional 50 trillion won supplementary budget to stimulate the economy. It seems like injecting fuel into an economic engine, but I think that this time it might be a different plan for some different sectors of the economy. I suppose it would be unavoidable to boost up the economy in spite of the inflation pressure at this moment. Going back to the normal and then return to the normal business cycle is very critical at this moment. But I want to stress, other than just the interest rate hike and then curbing down the inflation rate, what remains at this policy challenge is real estate market. While the new administration commented about that they will return to the from the regulation-based policy to the market policy, but still the apartment prices shows a rapid increase recently. So I might say it will be the first capacity test for the government. I mean the new government, depending on how to stabilize the prices in the real estate market and to solve the problem of supply bottleneck.
Right. Professor Song, as Professor Oh mentioned, Chung Kyung-ho, who has been nominated for the post of the finance minister, claimed that he will ensure the extra spending budget without stoking inflation or hampering financial stability. Is this possible?
Yes, but with reserve. So, as Professor Oh has pointed out, very good point, because the real estate issue would be a primary concern over the upcoming new administration. So some kind of ingenuity of the policy mix is necessarily needed. And then what is important is not to unanchor the inflation expectation. So if the inflation expectation is the rising price may be entrenched among the people, it's very difficult to hold down. So comparing those two countries, for example, in the US in the March, the inflation has reached 8.5%, whereas in Korea actually it is 4.1%. So relatively, even though the inflation fearmonger in Korea, academics and in the politics, they have concerned, and some media has emphasized the inflation pressure too much. So that could help. That could end up with the result of some too much pressure on the demand. So which means there is a high in order to quell down the rising inflation rate. If you increase the interest rate too hastily and too much, that could remove the demand, and that could end up with recess. That is a really trade-off relationship. So I believe that the new administration will focus on some moderate increase of the interest rate. So when compared even the yield curve, the yield of the bonds, the long-term bonds, in Korea we have just a 5-year bond and a 3-year bond, relatively stable. But in the US it is quite different because its yield curve is in reverse position, which means the short-term yield is very high, but long-term yield is relatively low. So which means it has been changed. So inflation expectation seems not entrenched even in the US, despite such a high level of inflation, short-term inflation rate. So supply bottleneck and the commodity price rise would be resolved because recently the freight container price, shipping price of the container of the 40-feet US tanker has been reduced. And also the oil price, which has reached almost $160 per barrel for Brent, but it has been down to right now the $100. So to that regard, this would be resolved. But the problem is, the obstacle is Ukraine-Russian war. So as long as this war continues, and then we are not sure how much impact would be unfolded in the upcoming later part of the year. So the reason why the Korean real estate market is quite important is, as Professor Oh mentioned, that the previous government, the incumbent government, who has failed to win the presidential election, actually they have employed a very diverse control of the real estate market, such as tax hikes, property tax hikes, and or debt service ratio, and or loan to value. All these measures turns out to be not ineffective. So in order to contain the house supply, so this is particularly, I believe that shortage of the supply, particularly in the vicinity of the Seoul, Gyeonggi metropolitan areas such as Seoul, Gyeonggi, and Busan. That could be the primary cause of the surging hike of some house price. But this is a global trend right now because of the pandemic, outbreak of the pandemic, and the aftermath of the coronavirus. Globally, in the US, the real estate market is very hot, very hot. So to that regard, relatively Korean market is not as hot as in the US, but soon it will be a problem, particularly when it is combined with some diverging wealth and income and the divide between the income and the wealth gap among the population. That could be another problem.
Right. Professor, this is an impromptu question, but given what Professor Song has just said, and you also mentioned the real estate market here in Korea, are there any tangible ways to address this particular problem then, do you think?
At this moment, the most tangible problem, as Professor Song commented about, I agree that the real tangible problem might be the supply problem in the real market. So supply bottleneck, supply disruption, nobody knows where the effect goes on. So when you're talking about the inflationary measures, it is very simple. According to textbook, it's very simple. Just as a step one, the tightening the money supply, and as a step two, interest rate hike. There are two options. One is a small step, and the other one is a big step. Small step means by 25 basis point. As today's the Bank of Korea raised the interest rate from 1.25 to 1.5. It is 25 basis point, a small step. And then relatively, when you say the big step, it is 50 basis point in worst cases. But as Professor Song commented about the volatility in the real estate market and the goods market, supply matters. Supply disruption cannot be solved as long as this kind of supply disruption risk continues in the market. Then the inflationary pressure might be highly volatile and then amplified after.
Right. Professor Song, as you mentioned, in theory, inflation can be tackled by reducing spending and by perhaps raising interest rates. But in practice, this particular measure would perhaps, like you said, substantially slow the economy.
That's right.
That being said, do you suppose the Bank of Korea should perhaps hold back on raising interest rates in the near future? Because it did raise it today, like Professor
Yeah, for the
said.
time being, today, as is announced, that 1.5% is base rate has been determined, and the moderate interest rate. But the process which drives the real estate price problem spillover effect over the other sectors of economy is coming from other sources. The reason is, as I mentioned earlier, what is important factor is the divide of the wealth and income gap. So the vicious, even despite some moderate interest rate hike, what affects the economy is some vicious spiral effect of the rising interest rate, particularly combined with the rising house price, can be really amplified due to the widening gap of the income and gap. The reason is because the middle class and the low income people, as long as the house price increased, they prefer jeonse in Korea or rental house in the US. Therefore, the demand for rental and the jeonse would be increased. Then it turns out to be the high demand of the rental house and the jeonse house means that the price of rental fee and the jeonse could be most likely to be increased a little bit. Then house investment turns out to be really attractive and lucrative prey for the rich people and the speculators in the house market. That's why the incumbent administration has been concerned about the role of the speculators. So this matters particularly when the divide between the income and wealth is large. Therefore, what I would like to suggest the new administration would be, they have to take care of, they have to combine every possible policy mix to satisfy and to nullify the spillover effect of the real estate high price over the other sectors. Once it is not controlled, then as long as the inflation expectation or house price expectation has been unanchored, then it could cause a really serious problem of the bubble and bust. So that is really bad for the Korean economy.
I see. Professor, simply speaking, when there is a problem, we seek to identify the problem and then address its negative impact. Having said that, what do you suppose is really driving Korea's inflation? Is it just the speculation, the housing market, or is it the volatile global oil market, or perhaps even the supply chain disruptions?
Combined,
all of them together?
All together. But let's simply speaking, there are two types of inflation. One is the cost comes from the supply side, and the other one is from the demand side. The main driver of Korean inflation comes from the supply side. This is called cost push inflation. Just because the cost of production increases, as a result, the level of production lowered, and then definitely investment will be delayed. And then what about the employment? Employment and then consumption will be shrunk. This is the situation Korea have to face and then have to struggle for the time being. And then as a way to get out of it, what the people think, and then people select a strategy. When the interest rate is too low, they resort to a strategic debt financing. It is a financial terminology, but it is very simple. Making money and then making a real estate fund from the bank by borrowing or by maximizing a home loan. And then they will change all their money into the real estate. So as Professor Song commented about repeatedly, the bone of contention at this moment is the real estate market, and then how to cut down the rippling effect of the fluctuations of real estate market. It is an inflection point for the new government, whether the government got a dominant power or not at this moment. When the interest rate becomes higher, then the people will change their financial strategy and then change their finance model into from the asset holding position from the real estate into the financial income generating assets, which means money flow through to the capital market. So there is the Bank of Korea and the economists might suggest that it might be the appropriate way to guide the inflation pressure into the appropriate way.
Right, I see. Professor Song, going back to plans for an extra budget bill by the incoming administration, now some pundits say that the Yoon administration may have to resort to a debt sale to fund an extra bill. Do you agree?
Partly, yes. The reason is, even though the fearmongers of the government deficit, they would like to increase the interest rate, but whereas as long as the extra budget, the source of the extra budget is not readily available from some reallocation of the national budget and some other extra earning of the revenues from the taxation, then they have no other choice but to issue the government bonds. So to that regard, the lower the interest rate would be favorable to the government. But however, considering the situation, the new President-elect Yoon has promised that to lower the property taxes. So tax revenue is most likely to be declined over time. And also, they have promised to reduce the transport tax. And so And also they would like to supply more houses to the market. Then what is expected in the house market and the economy is like really the house market is a very lucrative investment field for the wealthy people. So this could cause, as I mentioned earlier, the vicious spiral to occur within the economy. And as a way to avoid that, the government issued the government bonds. So I think that is an option because the current fiscal deficit of the Korean economy against the GDP is just 50%, which is quite a half of the OECD average, which is 98%. Of course, the economy is on the verge of the recess because of the Ukraine and the Russian war and some other factors. Still, we are a little bit concerned about the deficit, but not necessarily much, because for the Korean economy, unless the government bear the burden of the deficit, then private market or just the civilians and people must bear those brunt of the coronavirus and corona pandemic problems. Right. So that is the issue.
Professor, as Professor Song has just mentioned, how does Korea's national debt compare to that of its global counterparts?
Very sensitive to say, but from the perspective of affordability, it might be considered as acceptable. But from the speed and then timing of debt growth, I might say that time to slow down the growth rate and then reforming the debt ratio ever after. Government liability last year exceeded 2,000 trillion won. It is equivalent to 1.65 trillion US dollar. For the first time, as spending surge to fight the pandemic, increases in public service provision due to increased hiring also stress the budget in the future. Despite the economic urgency, speed of growth should have been controlled. Korea's 2021 national liability increasing 10.8% to 2,196 trillion won. And though it is not easy to compare country by country, but according to IMF data, the growth rate of debt to GDP ratio toward the 2026 projection, Korea ranked number one, 15.4% of growth rate. Then next is Czech Republic, 8.7%, and third is Belgium, 6.3%. Then Singapore is 6%. And then comparing just 6% debt to GDP rate, and then Korea's 15% of growth rate, then it is time to lower down the growth rate. When the first supplementary budget for this year, government debt expected to break 1,000 trillion won, and the debt to GDP ratio might be over 50%. So it is time to change and reform the debt to GDP ratio, and then more than anything else, due to the increased hiring of the government services, the government employee pension system should be reformed in the
incoming administration. Well, pundits are expecting the unit administration to perhaps tighten its purse strings.
Right.
So, Professor Song, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has also pledged to cut non-priority expenditures to finance his pledged support for small merchants. What might he be referring to?
Yeah, under the outgoing administration, President Moon Jae-in has promised to start the Korean New Deal, which comprised the three prongs, which was a digital New Deal, the other one is a Green New Deal, and the final is a human or welfare New Deal. But particularly for the Green New Deal, and which is related to the issue of the carbon issues, and the welfare New Deal, all those they have set up the plan, but has not executed yet. So these areas would be the most likely candidate for the reallocation or change of the as a non-priority expenditures.
I see. All right, Professor Song, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. Professor Oh, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.